Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is Cellular Energy for Biology 1 students. When we're looking at cellular energy and we're talking about how energy flows through an ecosystem, the very first thing we identify is the difference between organisms that are called autotrophs and organisms that are called heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that primarily use sunlight energy to make organic compounds. Now, there are some that will use sources other than sunlight energy, but that's the one that's most common, and that's really the one that we'll focus on for this sequence and course. Those organisms that are using photosynthesis, or using sunlight, are doing a process called photosynthesis, and you can see that right here on your screen. Photosynthesis are organisms that do things, or the organisms that do photosynthesis. There we go. Are organisms, most commonly we just call them plants. Heterotrophs get energy from food instead of directly from sunlight. So these are the organisms that have to consume something else. They do a process that we call cellular respiration. Of course, you can see an image here, of course, the great white taking down some kind of prey there. I had to pick a picture that wasn't too violent. But you can see there that it's having to eat something else. Why do you eat the things that you eat? And it's because you get energy from that. That's why you have to eat lunch every day or whatever meal you eat. Hopefully it's more than one meal a day. And that gives you the energy that you need. Now, the energy that we use for life comes in the form of ATP. So the food that you eat primarily will break down into either glucose, a carbohydrate, proteins, or fats like lipids. So everything you eat primarily will break down into one of those three. All of those things can be used to make ATP, and that's adenosine triphosphate. The energy is right here in its triple phosphate bonds. This third phosphate right here stores all the energy, and when your body needs energy, it will break that third phosphate off and release energy that the cell will use to doing various things that it does. So the most common thing that we use in the process of making ATPs is glucose. So that's where we're going to look today. To make glucose, we primarily start with photosynthesis, those autotrophs. And they are going to take carbon dioxide and water, and they're going to make or yield sugar, like glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas. Now, this process provides energy for almost all of life. Every thing out there that you would think of as living, for the most part, gets energy from photosynthesis, either directly, meaning it does photosynthesis, or indirectly, meaning it eats something that does photosynthesis, or eats something that ate something that does photosynthesis, so on and so forth. So let's look at this process. It's primarily broken down into 3 steps. The first stage is energy is captured. Now, energy is captured in the thylakoid. Now, if you go back here, the thylakoid are these little discs right here inside of the chloroplast. The chloroplast is the organelle that's responsible for photosynthesis. So when we look closer at those discs, we see that in this disc are proteins in the membrane. And this is called an electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane. And in that, this right here and this right here are pigments. And those pigments will take sunlight energy, and when they absorb sunlight energy, they will throw off an electron. That electron will be passed down the electron transport chain here in this membrane, and as it's passed down that electron transport chain, it will allow hydrogens to be pumped into the thylakoid. And this will build up a hydrogen ion concentration gradient. Now, this is the beginnings of energy, of sunlight energy being captured, being converted from something other than thermal energy or UV radiation or just this heat source coming to us, to the earth. It's the beginnings of taking that heat source and putting it into an organic compound that your body can then use to make ATP. Stage 2 takes that hydrogen ion concentration gradient that's been developed. It allows those hydrogens to pass out of ATP synthase. And you can see that right here on the screen, that ATP synthase, I tell you in class, this is my favorite membrane protein, if you can have one, if I'm that nerdy, and I am. As hydrogens pass through ATP synthase, it allows ATP synthase to generate energy that it's going to store in ATP. The other thing that it's doing is the electrons that are being passed down the electron transport chain here are being put into what we call electron carriers. In this case, I think of them as dump trucks. They carry an electron from one place to another, like a dump truck would carry something down the road. So NADPH is the dump truck that photosynthesis uses to carry electrons. Now, those are going to come into important in the next step. So now you've got ATP and NADPH. Now, a lot of students miss this, especially Bio 1 students, when it comes to ATP formation and photosynthesis. Because we'll ask the question, does photosynthesis make ATPs for the cell? The answer technically for that would be no. Although it does make ATPs, all of those ATPs are going to be used in the Calvin cycle right here that you can see on the screen. The Calvin cycle will take ATP energy, electrons being carried by NADPH, and carbon dioxide gas, and it will build or make an organic compound called glucose. This is also called carbon fixation because it's taking carbon dioxide gas that is pretty much useless to most things and putting it into the form of a compound that is very important for life called glucose or organic compound. It's also called light independent because light is not needed for this process to take place. Light is needed for stage 1 and stage 2 to take place. Stage 3, light is technically not needed for this to happen. So then we go from, now we've made glucose, we've made oxygen. Oxygen was made way back here. Sorry, I skipped it. Oxygen was made right here because water comes in to replace the electron that the pigment lost and will split to make oxygen. So now you've got oxygen, you've got glucose, and now you're ready for cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is going to take glucose and oxygen and make carbon dioxide, water, and then this part right here, the very important part, energy and ATP, in the form of ATP. So the first thing we're going to look at is called aerobic respiration. Stage 1 is in the cytoplasm of the cell, glucose will be broken down into 2 pyruvates, and you can see that right here. To get this process started, we add 2 ATPs. As that molecule breaks in 2, it releases electrons. Those electrons will be picked up by dump trucks in cellular respiration. The most common one is NADH, and it will make 4 ATP molecules. So glucose is converted to pyruvate. In doing this, you produce a small amount of ATPs, and you produce a couple NADH, or you fill up a couple dump trucks with electrons. Then that pyruvate will be transformed as it goes into the mitochondria into acetyl-CoA. It's acetyl with a coenzyme A attached to it. To do that, you release a carbon dioxide and you make an NADH molecule. Every time you break a molecule apart, it releases electrons. NADH or FADH2, which you're going to see here, is going to catch those electrons. So acetyl-CoA then goes into what we call the Krebs cycle, which is in the inside part of the mitochondria, and it will turn like a wheel. And as it turns, it will break carbon dioxides off. So a pyruvate has 3 carbon dioxides. 1 carbon dioxide is broken off as pyruvate comes into the mitochondria and turns into acetyl-CoA. The other 2 carbon dioxides are broken off as the Krebs cycle turns. So as all those electrons are being released, we're filling up dump trucks, NADH and FADH2. Those are just electron carriers or dump trucks that carry electrons from one place to another. This Krebs cycle has to turn twice to break a molecule of glucose down because glucose was broken into 2 pyruvate. Both of those pyruvate will go into the Krebs cycle, so it will turn 2 whole times. Then NADH and FADH2 will dump their electrons into the third stage, the electron transport chain. As the electrons are passed from one protein to the next, they release energy. That energy will pump hydrogens across the membrane. This is happening in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. If you remember how mitochondria is drawn, it's got like this worm type in the inside of it that goes back and forth. That's the inner membrane. So hydrogens are being pumped from inside the mitochondria across this membrane to this middle area between the outer membrane of the mitochondria and that inner membrane. As the electrons get to the end of the electron transport chain, they have to be picked up by someone, and oxygen is there to do that. Oxygen will pick up the electron and turn into water. There is a hydrogen ion concentration gradient that is now formed in that space between the outer and inner membrane of the mitochondria. So those hydrogens want to diffuse back across that membrane, and they do so through ATP synthase once again. But this time, as ATP synthase allows those hydrogens to fuse, you make massive amounts of ATP, way more than what was made in photosynthesis. One, if you look and can do a comparison, this one has 3 proton pumps, whereas in photosynthesis, technically it only has really 1 proton pump in there that's pumping those hydrogens across that membrane. So you end up with a greater hydrogen concentration gradient, which ends up making way more ATPs, and this is where all living things get ATP energy, is through the use of this. Everything that is eukaryotic, that is, gets ATP through ATP synthase right here in cellular respiration of the mitochondria. When oxygen is absent, then the electron transport chain shuts down and the Krebs cycle shuts down. So pyruvate is made, and the cell did make some ATPs when it did that. So it wants to continue something. If oxygen is not present, let's say when you're working out, you don't get oxygen to the muscles like it needs to. So if oxygen is not present in those muscles, it needs to do something to keep those cells alive. So it does a process called fermentation. And this is a process of allowing NADH that's made in glycolysis to dump those electrons back to pyruvate, and in doing this, that turns pyruvate into lactic acid. And you get lactic acid buildup in your muscles when you're working out, and that makes them really sore, and that's if you've ever done something and you've gotten sore in your muscles, it's because of lactic acid fermentation. In some organisms, they do what we call alcoholic fermentation. They will release a carbon dioxide molecule, they'll accept that NADH electron, and they'll turn into ethanol. And things like yeast do this, and we use yeast for various things in cooking and beverage making. So this allows glycolysis to continue, which allows some ATPs to be made and the cell to not die. As a little overview here of cellular respiration, you've got glucose being broken down in glycolysis to pyruvate. This makes a couple ATPs. Technically it makes 4, but you had to use 2 to start it. So you say it makes 2 ATPs total. And that pyruvate then, when oxygen is present, goes to the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, and that makes about 38 ATPs. If oxygen is not present, then it goes to fermentation to at least allow glycolysis to continue.